Hello. Hi everyone. This is the third session of non-academic careers. This is about careers in scientific publishing, and we have Becca and Laura here. Becca is from Nature Geoscience, and Laura from Nature Reviews or the Environment. Yeah, cool, amazing. So they're just like we did on the last sessions. They're going to introduce themselves quickly, and we're going to move to discussion. There's quite a lot of people far back. Could you move maybe a little bit forward so it's like easier? And they're also like for the discussion with them. I think it will be easier if you don't mind. So yeah, let's start.
Some good movement happening here. Come forwards. It's going to make it a lot easier for us to talk if you come forwards.
Thank you guys. We won't put you on the spot and make you answer questions.
Unless you're sat on the back row.
Yeah, we might. Oh. Either way, you can be extra. Okay, cool. All right, so, okay, yeah, I thought there was something. I feel much more like, I don't know, like an MC when I have these. I think I was in LA doing my PhD, so I think that impacted me a little bit. So hi everyone, I'm Laura. I am an editor with Nature Reviews, Earth and Environment. We have our handy sign over here that you guys can look at. It got here all the way from London, so I'm excited to finally see it up. I've been carrying it around Barcelona. This is very rewarding here. And yeah, so I've been an editor for almost 6 months now. My background is in biogeochemistry, so I did an undergraduate degree actually in biology in Texas, and then I did my PhD. Technically, the degree is marine biology and biological oceanography, but I don't know anything about dolphins. I break a lot of hearts that way. So many kids have their hopes dashed, and they're like, you study whales. I'm like, no. Sometimes I forget if narwhals are real, frankly. So, and there I studied a lot of sediment biogeochemistry, and then I moved on to studying soils and agricultural systems at University of California, Davis. And throughout this process, I knew I liked research a lot, but I really wanted to do something beyond just looking at my own specific research questions. And I would always get really excited about getting a table of contents from journals coming out and seeing, oh, this group published this thing and this group published this thing. And I remember 6 months ago, somebody else published something similar to this. So when I first saw a call for a professional editor at one of the nature journals, I realized that that was actually a job that you could do. And I got really excited. The job description just felt like it was written for me. It said, like, you know, do you really like science, but you feel like you're constrained by your own research? Do you like reading outside of your discipline a lot? Do you like reading and writing? And I was like, yes, 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 all these things. This is perfect. And I applied for that one. I was way too young. I was like a fourth-year PhD student in America, so I still have at least another year. And I did not get that one, I think, or the next time I applied. So it was the third or fourth time I applied for an editor job that I got it. So don't give up. My goal actually was if I applied enough times, maybe they would hire me just so that they would stop seeing my application. And I haven't asked my boss if that's why I was hired, but he's not here, so I'll pretend like it wasn't. And yeah, so since then I've been working at this Nature Reviews journal that we're launching in January. So that's been really exciting, being on the ground floor of something like a new journal. And my job is going to be a little bit different from Becca's, which she'll talk about. So you're all familiar with primary research versus things like reviews. So since I deal mostly with reviews and perspectives and not new data, I have a bit of a different job. So most of my job is doing a lot of the things I really loved, like going through tables of contents and figuring out what are the new things that are being published, where the state of science is for a lot of different sciences. So I know I mentioned I'm a biogeochemist by training, but in my current position, I cover biogeochemistry, geomorphology, hydrology, pollution science, kind of a gamut. So it's really fun. There's a lot of hands-on learning, a lot of Wikipediaing everything. Scientific jargon that you're like, oh, I didn't know that was a word, or oh, that word means something completely different in my field versus in this other field. And from there, I get to do things like figure out, okay, should we review this topic? Is this timely? If it is timely, who should write it? And then help shepherd the review through the whole review process until the point where you see it published and in its final glorious form. And I think that's everything I have to say at the moment, and I would love to hear any questions from you guys after Becca does her introduction and we get going.
Hi, I'm Becca. And I've been an editor at Nature Geoscience now for just over 2 years. And for some context, I think it was 2 years ago at Goldschmidt, that was the Paris Goldschmidt, that was my first Goldschmidt as an editor, and I had defended my PhD the week before. And I'd been working as an editor for about 6 months before that in training. So things can turn around very quickly. The Goldschmidt before Paris, I wouldn't have even, a little bit like you, known that an editorial position could be a professional job until I saw that job advertised. And again, I was sat in my PhD office, and I could have been looking at molybdenum isotope data, which is what my PhD was on, but instead I was kind of thinking, what do I do next? Academia doesn't quite feel right, but also totally stepping outside of that world, never going to Goldschmidt again, never being at the forefront of research, having that excitement when you see cool work. I couldn't quite imagine leaving that behind, so I didn't really know what I was going to do, and that has been a theme of my entire career in education, is not really knowing what the end goal was, and I still don't. So yeah, I applied for the job. The job was also based in Shanghai, and honestly, I didn't think I had much hope of getting that job. The caveat to that is, I'm obviously very good at my job, but generally they kind of suggest that maybe you have some postdoc experience, and I didn't. I was coming out of my PhD, so I thought, there'll be more experienced people. The reason I think they suggest postdoc experience is useful is because as an editor, you have to broaden out your science so much more than when you're kind of a PhD student. So I went from studying molybdenum isotopes in geothermal waters, pretty niche, it's neither high temperature nor low temperature in this weird mix in the middle, to handling papers on the entirety of the Archean, whether that's oxygenation of the atmosphere or onset of plate tectonics. I cover biogeochemistry in the oceans, I cover volcanology, I cover ore geology, economic geology, including actual economics papers. So the important thing is that, as Laura was saying, you have to really enjoy going outside of your comfort zone and learning and picking up ideas, and applying that and assessing work. I suppose maybe a brief description of what I as an editor do, which again is slightly different from how Laura's role works, is because I'm mostly handling primary research. And the main job, unfortunately, to some extent, of a research journal like Nature Geoscience is actually to reject papers before they go out to peer review. So I reject 80% of the work, approximately, before it's sent to a peer reviewer. So the vast majority of my time is spent reading a manuscript that someone sends me and assessing what is the conclusion, how does that conclusion compare to the state of the field, which is why coming to conferences is really useful, and am I convinced that the advance that paper shows is going to be interesting to all of my readers? So that's my job. If I'm not convinced of those things, then we reject it before peer review. Then it's my job to handle the peer review process. So who are going to be the experts that are going to assess this paper as kind of meeting community standards? And for me, that was part of the job that I really enjoyed. It was kind of exciting to see how papers go from sometimes being, it's a good paper, to a really fantastic paper through this review and revise process and really proactive collaboration often between these groups of scientists. That's most of my job. A small component of the job is obviously coming to conferences, keeping up to date with the scientific community, trying to represent the views of the scientific community within the journal. So we also commission content that I'm sure Nature Reviews Earth and Environment will as well, in terms of community interest. So if there's something around field work that's a problem and that someone has a really interesting point of view on that, we can commission work which we call front half. It's slightly more journalistic. We can also write pieces, so we write editorials. There's one coming out in September around peer review, so we've analysed some data from our journal on diversity within peer review. So who are we including? Are we including men and women in proportion to who are our authors? What about geographic diversity? For me, that's a part of the job that I love, because I love working for my community. And I think that's part of my role. Why did I choose editorial and not staying in research? I think possibly similar to what you were saying. Throughout my PhD, I realized that I was spending an awful lot of time prioritizing other people's work over my own. I was in a research group in the University of Iceland, which I loved, and I read every single paper that came out of that research group during my time. And it went from editing English to kind of saying, wow, I think if you restructured the entirety of this to tell the story this way, it would be a much better paper. And I realized that I would always drop all of my own work in order to do that. If I was at a conference, I'd be like, oh my gosh, have you met my colleague? They're amazing, they're doing great work in this. I would very rarely advocate for my own work. And I think those skills fit very well into the editorial sphere. And just a few prompts in case people are thinking of questions. Totally willing to talk about anything. Some things that I came up with when I was thinking about careers outside of academia is there's often a big gap or skills discrepancy between what we as PhD students feel we can offer and actually what we can offer. Often we focus on technical abilities, so we're really good at running an ICP-MS. We don't necessarily realize what that means in terms of your ability to fix machines, you can follow procedures, you have health and safety awareness. There are so many skills involved in our work that we forget about. So skills discrepancy is one. Communication kind of fits in with that. I think in general we all need to be better at communicating and understanding what employers want from us and therefore telling them and showing them what we can offer. And the third thing affects different people differently, but I think there's often a kind of emotional aspect to leaving, quote unquote, academia, and expectations from supervisors and your peer group. So they would be three things that I would maybe emphasize. Questions? Question time.
Yeah.
Someone's got to start, otherwise this is going to be very short.
Yay.
Hey, hi, thanks. I'm just wondering, like, did you guys do any, I'm over here. Did you do any, like, extracurricular, I don't know what else to call it, writing, like, during your PhD or before your PhD that helped you get this editorial job? Or?
Yeah, I did some, which originally I didn't, start doing because I wanted to be an editor, but because I really enjoyed it. So I would write for an educational blog called Ocean Bites. There's several different bites, insert your favorite topic here now, where once a month I would find a primary research article that I liked, something to do with oceanography, as vague as that could be, and take this primary research article and write maybe 1,000 words to 2,000 words in a very understandable way. So the idea was so that like a high schooler could read it, so high school teachers could look at it, say pick one and talk about it. And find appropriate graphics for that, and also had to consider copyright things, which was my first introduction to copyright, which is actually really useful in the current job. And then once a month I would also edit somebody else's. So almost act like both an editor and a peer reviewer. Like, does this seem like you interpreted the science correctly, and also is this something that's structured well and that you could hand out to the rest of the world and somebody who's smart and literate but not a scientist could read. So I thought that was really helpful.
No. Short but sweet.
Can you do your job from home, or do you have to be in an office?
the question is, can we do our job from home? Within editorial, within our company, we are encouraged to work at least 3 days of the week in one of our editorial offices. They are based in London, Berlin, Shanghai, and New York. 2 days a week can be at home. That is primarily, I think, for kind of teamwork, office cohesion, understanding the company, going to meetings, because the fundamental part of the job is done on my laptop. You might see it's in the corner, kind of responding to emails. We have a centralized system in which manuscripts come in, they get assigned to the most appropriate editor with the most appropriate background, and then we can read everything online, we can make assessments online, we can communicate with our colleagues online. And of course, I'm based in Shanghai, most of our team is based in London, so we're not on the same time zone. That's very common. So there's not necessarily a requirement for kind of real-time conversations. Saying that, I personally work in the office 5 days a week because I like to keep my professional and my personal life separate. So you can kind of play around with it a little bit.
Yeah, I would agree with that. We have the option to work at home. I generally don't, but I don't know. I like all my office mates. I like seeing them, which sounds nerdy, but
A little nerdy.
yeah, just a little bit. But I mean, I guess that's why we're here.
Just to say, I suppose we both technically work under the same company, so different companies may or may not have different rules for that. I actually don't know how much other companies would allow you to work at home. It might be more.
I'm just curious that why are your offices based on so many different places? People can just send everything to one place and you don't even have the time difference with your... I don't know, because...
It's a really good question. And if only we had someone from the head of the company so we could understand company strategy, that might be really helpful. Yeah, we don't make these choices. But I can say from our perspective, when I was employed by Nature Geoscience, the team went from an editorial team of 5 to an editorial team of 6. So I wasn't a replacement hire, I was a new hire. And the job was specifically mandated to be based in the Shanghai office. That's unusual. Often it will be kind of available for different offices, depending on what the chief editor would prefer and things like that. The reason for that is because although most of our job is done via the laptop, there is a small component of the job, for instance, coming to conferences or going and visiting universities and laboratories, communicating with research communities and understanding what they want from us, what might be the challenges to them publishing with us, communicating what we want from them is easier to do if we're kind of geographically dispersed. And from my point of view, although I'm based in Shanghai, I actually frequently get emails from Australia and New Zealand based reviewers and authors because they're so surprised to have a kind of automatic real-time response from an editor because they're so used to this time delay of kind of them sending a quick question, a day's delay, then getting back to them. And they're kind of like, oh, you're online in the middle of the night? And I'm like, no, I work in Shanghai. So there's certain things like that where it's advantageous to be spread around.
Thanks. So you kind of already touched on this a little bit, but how much specific editing experience or proofreading experience did you have before getting the job, and how much of a role did or didn't that play in getting the job?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I would say from my perspective, it was all informal. So editing was very much, again, English language editing unofficially for my research group. And I suspect my supervisor will have put that in his recommendation letter. They certainly were very grateful for the work I did. None of it was official. We're lucky in that we have copy editors for our journal. So actually in terms of editing, I don't edit the English so much. We'll restructure things like the abstract and we'll work with authors to make sure that the content and the story flows in the best way possible. Especially most papers will have their title and abstract edited, as that's kind of the main point of access for most people. And so we want to make them as accessible as possible, and that's where the kind of editorial expertise comes in explaining concepts clearly. In terms of English language, we have professional copy editors that would do that, and also art editors who will go in and help with figures and making that high quality as well.
Yeah, I had a similar experience where in graduate school I did a lot of informal editing for English language, for structure. A lot of our advising within my group also was a lot of between graduate students. So as I got older as a graduate student, I did a lot of not just like line editing, but actually like restructuring for our younger grad students for things. And I think it was really helpful. I had close ties with like the real geologists, not just people in my own department, and I did a lot of helping out with them, so that gave me kind of a broad experience with, okay, I'm looking at this remote sensing of earthquakes piece, and I don't understand any of the technical stuff, but I can see that this isn't really flowing. And I think probably I do a little more hands-on editing. We do a lot more restructuring of pieces and saying, okay, this is great content, but it's maybe not in the best order, stuff like that. So I think being able to draw on those experiences has been good, but I've never done this in a paid capacity before.
Just say, I suppose, one advantage, if it's not necessarily so much that you can demonstrate the skill set, but it's also just internally knowing that you actually enjoy spending that much time working on the details of someone else's work. I would say kind of the thing that I found challenging about this role is that 80% of my day is exactly the same. The content changes, and the content is great. Even the papers we're rejecting are some really fantastic science. That's always interesting, but I'm still sat in front of my computer screen reading a paper. And I think you have to really enjoy that process, because if you've had a bad day, and when I was a PhD student and I wasn't able to read or write, I'd go down to the lab and I'd wash 1,000 Teflon beakers and I'd put a podcast on. Or I would have a day where I'm like, oh, I can do data manipulation, or I'll make graphics. There is less ability to have that variety within this job. As I say, the content of the work is always changing, and that's what keeps it interesting for me. But actually the process is still, I have to make decisions every day. I have to read 2 papers and the associated literature every day. So I think having the experience of doing that for your colleagues gives you some confidence that you're going to be able to enjoy and make the most out of that.
I also want to mention, we're both native English speakers, but actually a lot of our editorial aren't. I mean, obviously they're fluent in English, but that's a lot of science anyways. So, if you aren't American or British or Australian, that doesn't hold you back. I think it's more the critical thinking and seeing the structure and the details of the piece, not so much like, I mean, nature stuff is all in British English anyways, which I don't spell in. that's what we have copy editors for. I don't know how to actually diagram out a sentence, which horrifies my poor mom. But yeah, so you don't have to be a native English speaker. Just wanted to mention that.
Hi. So you're both editors, and you mentioned that there was copy editors and art editors. What other roles, like what do your colleagues do? Is it just editing, or are there other positions?
I know, you might.
So in terms of people that have kind of academic background in PhD kind of level, that tends to be more the content editing, so what we do. For instance, our copy editors won't necessarily be specifically geologists. They will copy edit for a variety of different journals. They'll often be highly educated in the physical sciences, often with a master's or PhD, but it would be not specifically to geology. Same with our art editors. So actually part of the job that I like with our art editors is taking a sketch that an author has done for, say, a News and Views, and they just kind of drawn a volcano, and sort of translating that for our art editors, because they have no idea what a volcano should look like. Then within the company, we also have editorial assistants. We work very closely with them. They do a lot of making sure the manuscripts are kind of uploaded, a lot of the file work that we do, communicating with authors. We also have a huge sales team who work in, especially at the moment, and this is a conversation that will be far more complicated, the research journals and the reviews journals are subscription-based, so they will be selling subscriptions to libraries, so we have a whole sales team and marketing team for that. We have people who work in masterclasses, which are when editors will go out to universities and teach scientific writing courses. There's a whole side of the company that does that kind of thing. We obviously have like office administration, we have the IT department. There's a lot of different roles within the company. It's also not just journal editors, but we also have book editors. So we have those across physical life sciences and also the humanities. The amount of books that they commission kind of terrifies me when I compare it to how many papers I publish. They'll be commissioning potentially 100 books a year. And again, it's still an editorial role. They do have PhDs, but it's a different way of working as an editor. They are not expected to read every detail of that book. So yeah, there's quite a lot going on.
Yeah.
Did I miss any?
There's also something that some editors will go into after a while of editing is, what is it? It's vaguely called publishing. So they're much more strategy. So they have editorial backgrounds and they know, what it takes to keep a journal running, but they look more at trends and overall say, okay, where are we maybe missing some journals? What sort of new journals should we have? Things like that. And then there's also for Nature itself, and I think other journals or other companies will have this also, people who are scientifically trained who are basically doing science reporting now. So they're, like anywhere from mathematicians to biologists to social scientists, and they function much more as reporters, but reporters on a very high scientific level who do a lot to take really complicated new research or news stories and make it into something that I think we can all more broadly understand.
That's a good point. So actually I often get somewhat biased in my editorial view because I work as a professional editor for the research journals, but the vast majority of the journals within Spring and Nature are not edited by professional editors. They are edited by academic editors, and yet they would be managed by a chief editor who may be in-house, may not be, and then they'll have a publisher or a managing editor that sits over the top. And they become especially useful, as you said, in terms of strategy, and also if there ever gets sort of an ethical concern over a publication, then as the publishing house, we take a lot of responsibility in kind of managing that. The expectation isn't that the academic editor would have to handle that. So yeah, that's a really good point.
How this one?
I just have one question. That how about the financial funding for the journal, like from the publish, from the scientists or from the government or any? Can you say about that? Because the fact I thought the budget is very important to running any organization. So I just curiosity.
Yeah, the budget is important. So there's a lot of different business models within Spring and Nature. The research journals are currently under a subscription system, which means that as an author, you don't pay to publish with us. It means that the libraries will pay to have access to the articles. However, if you look at Nature Communications, they're open access, so authors will pay a page fee for publishing in Nature Communications, but then it's all freely available online. And depending on the journal within the company, we offer both of those. Of course, with Plan S coming along, there's going to be a lot of changes within publishing, including within Spring and Nature as well in the future. So that business model, I imagine, is going to be evolving a lot. But yeah, at the moment, Nature reviews and also the research journals are subscription-based.
I have a question about education requirements for working in scientific publishing. So I currently work as a scientist at Johnson Space Center with a master's, but I also have been added to the social media team, so I report on the science that comes out of my department. So my original plans for going back to a PhD are a little bit up in the air right now. So as two people who finished your PhD before getting into publishing, what's your opinion on experience versus education and how to best prepare yourself for a career in the field?
Yeah, that's a really bit on where exactly you want to go. So for all of our editors, we have to have a PhD. For general, more science communication and science reporting, I know a lot of really fantastic science reporters who have masters and have a lot of experience. So it sort of depends on your specific goal. I think experience with a scientific master's is super important and will get you, a really long way in most things. For us and for a lot of editors, I think it is required explicitly to have a PhD, but otherwise, experience is so valuable. It's hard to beat that.
Yeah, just to reiterate, it does say on the kind of job description that a PhD is required. And I don't know if that would ever be flexible. I'm fortunately at the moment not involved in hiring. But I would say that actually the skills that I have are not directly because I did a PhD. It's the time that it gave me, the kind of time I spent in academia, the breadth of people I was working with, my access to different people. So I was working as an aqueous geochemist, but I was in a volcanology group. I was also embedded in a high temperature research community. So I think it's that diversity of thought that I then bring to editorial. So I mean, you could risk it and see what happens. It's kind of what I did when the postdoc is only a kind of suggested we would like. The PhD for our company does seem to be a requirement. There was once a rumor of someone with a master's many, many years ago, but I've never actually met them. But I suppose my recommendation, if you're not sure about whether the PhD is the right route, would be to find some people who have careers that you would potentially like. It seems like you're quite committed already to kind of science communication, and just contact them, reach out and see what actually the requirements are, rather than kind of just taking our word for it, because I couldn't tell you that every editor requires a PhD.
Hi. I was wondering, so how steep kind of your learning curve was, and if there was some sort of introduction that you got from your bosses, or like a leeway period or anything like that?
So steep. Well, fortunately, I started work on the 1st of May, which in the UK was a bank holiday. So that was a great first day in the professional world. I was just on holiday. My first actual day in the office, so my second day on the job, was actually the first day that I accessed the manuscript handling system and was faced with my first manuscript. To reassure everyone, there is an extensive training period. So whilst you're training, you will read the manuscript, you'll make an assessment, this is for primary research, and you'll make a recommendation. And rather than sending that decision to an author, it will go past a senior editor who's much more experienced, who will kind of read what you've said, read the manuscript, critique how you've looked at the paper, and then kind of guide you as to how you read a paper and how you think about it. But it was quite a shock to me, I suppose, that I had access to potentially clicking the wrong button and, like, in my head, rejecting every single paper that had been submitted to Nature. That is actually very hard to do. There's a few safety nets in place, but it freaked me out initially. So yeah, you're on the job straight away, but you do have a good safety net and support background there. But it was certainly a shock, the amount of work that we reject. That's something that I hadn't really thought about. I'd thought about publishing papers. I hadn't thought about the responsibility to reject papers. And that, for me as a personality, was very challenging.
Yeah, I 100% agree with a very steep learning curve. I am still in it in a lot of ways. It's been a bit different from Becca's experiences, both because we're a new journal and because I am working at a reviews journal. So I wasn't immediately assessing manuscripts, but I was pretty quickly coming up with review ideas and trying to figure out things like scope, or what makes a good review idea, what makes something timely and exciting. And yeah, in addition to sort of the nuts and bolts of the job, there was also a super steep learning curve in terms of taking my already like fairly broad research background and immediately translating that into, okay, great, now you need to go learn about a completely different field. And there was also, and still is, some imposter syndrome. Editors get it too, where I'm emailing these people whose names I've heard of at conferences and are like plenary speakers, and saying like, hey, you don't know this is my 3rd day on the job, but do you want to write for us? And oh no, they did not. I never tell anyone.
It's
too
secret
much
for
more.
this room only.
Yeah. And giving guidance to authors on saying, I don't know how correct maybe some of the science is. That's for reviewers, but I really think you should consider getting rid of half the material you've proposed talking about. So that was also a steep learning curve, like how to be firm but very polite, and when to give and everything like that. So actually a lot of the things that you struggle with during your PhD, I had to get to grips with quite quickly.
And I'd also just mention that it doesn't seem to stop. So in the research journals, who are handling mostly primary research, we tend to sort of say there's sort of 6 months to a year, you're a kind of fully trained editor. But still, because every manuscript is different, every manuscript takes a slightly different path. You'll come across new situations every single day that you're on the job. New ethical issues will come up, and you'll have to sort of get your head around a load of different things. So yeah, I think the learning doesn't really stop, which is a good thing, but sometimes you just wish that the ethical issues didn't come up and you didn't have to learn that lesson too.
I do want to reiterate that we do get a lot of on-the-job training. Like, my boss does a lot of metaphorical hand-holding with me, where I'm like, is this okay? Will you read this email before I send it? So nobody throws you out, I mean, you kind of get thrown into the deep end, but they also are like, it's okay, we're helping you, so don't feel afraid if you're like, oh, I don't know if I know how to do this thing. They have training in place for that, and they, we're representatives of the company, and they invest in making sure that we, know what we're doing and how we're doing it.
Yeah, so maybe to explain some kind of hierarchy. So you have, in general, what we call associate editors, which is what we both are. You can then, after a couple of years, when you've demonstrated enough skills, you can become a senior editor. The job essentially stays the same. Above that, you have the chief editor, who is responsible for the journal. Above them, you'll also have kind of editors-in-chief that kind of have an overview over, say, all of the physical science journals. And so every time that an issue comes up, and I'm not sure about something, I could turn to a senior colleague if it's just a kind of quick question. If I think it's more in depth and has maybe a journal implication, I can go and talk to my chief editor. If it's something that is potentially a bigger concern, say an ethical issue on a paper that comes up, that will then get escalated. So there's a whole team of people that can give insight. So although, yeah, my day is still, learning curve is very steep, there's enough people around that have seen a lot of things before. There are a few editors that have been around for a good kind of 20, 30 years in the job, so they look after us pretty well.
I can just yell. Kind of following up on that a bit, I'm curious, you both are kind of relatively new to the job, and I'm curious if you see yourself staying in this position long term, and do people ever go back to academia or leave for other jobs? You could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, people move around, and some people do go back into academia. I think it's actually, from my experience of kind of my colleagues so far, it's relatively rare that people have gone back into academia, although I know a lot of people find it as a reassurance that kind of when they take this step, a lot of people will say to me when I was thinking about this job, first of all, a lot of my academic supervisors and colleagues were like, oh, I think you should just try a postdoc. Like, your PhD was whatever, try a postdoc, you might really like it. And I was like, no, I don't think that's the way. Like, go on, just try it. I'm like, no. And then I got this job and they're like, well, that's great experience. You can come back and be really good at writing papers. And I was like, cool, but I don't think I will. And even at this conference, one of my former PhD supervisors, who I won't name, but you might be able to figure it out if you Google me, came up to me and said, oh, what are your plans for the future? Do you think you'll become a scientist? And then there was an awkward pause, and he mentioned, again, I was like, well, that's, that's great. So yeah, some people do go back into research. From my experience, it's not very many. From the people that I know that have left, they've gone to kind of JOLSOC in London, so some kind of societies that are associated with their field. Some have moved into sort of chief editor roles within the company and also externally. So when other companies launch journals, some people have moved into those. If anyone noticed the name Lewis Collins, who was going to be on this panel, he was formerly an editor at Nature Communications, and he's moved to be a chief editor in another journal. So some people stay within editorial, but shift around between companies. I know someone who's left because she wanted to retrain in data science, so she kind of missed that part of her research life, I think. So she's not in academic research anymore, but she's kind of shifted back into, I guess, a more data-based world.
Yeah, I had sort of a similar experience with, you know, I wanted to postdoc. I didn't feel too much like I was pushed into it. Like, there's definitely the pressure to do it. I was like, well, okay, I want to try. I've been in kind of a like smaller field that's maybe I just want to try something different. So I did, and you know, I had like a really nice advisor, but when I told her I am interviewing for this job, by the way, she was like, I mean, that's great, but if you get it, like, you can never come back to academia. And she didn't mean it direly. She just loved her job so much, and actually seeing how much she loved her job, even when she was writing grants, and being like, every time I write a fellowship proposal, I like the writing part and hate every other part of it. So, and yeah, I was okay with that. I was like, actually, yeah. And you know, you do build a skill set as an editor that's different from some of the skills you build as a PhD student or a postdoc. So, I mean, I still feel very much like a scientist. I just don't have to pipette things anymore, which, you know, I think I still have the pipetting muscles, but I'm glad to not have to do that. And yeah, people move into jobs that build on both their skill sets as a scientist and as somebody who's more experienced now with editorial, and go from there into things like science communication and data science and stuff like that.
One more question.
Hello, I would just like to know if the hours we spend formatting papers makes your job significantly easier. Please tell me it does.
It depends how you format the paper. Honestly, we read the paper. I think a lot of people find that surprising. And I will read the paper pretty much no matter what format it comes in. If you send me a paper without line numbers, that's really annoying, because either I have to remember, if I'm going to send it to review, to email you to get used to send it with line numbers, or if I forget, we're going to end up with a very annoyed peer reviewer. So my top tip is to definitely always put the line numbers. I hadn't appreciated how much I liked double line spacing. When I was writing that for my supervisor, I'd be like, why are we, this just looks ridiculous. Actually, now that I spend all day on my screen reading, if someone sends me a paper where it's condensed, if I can do anything to put that spacing back to double spaced, I will, because it just is nicer to read. Saying formatting, I do always kind of have a little chuckle to myself when someone sends me the paper formatted as a Nature Geoscience paper, because it's totally unnecessary. In general, for us, we kind of say that the formatting at initial submission doesn't really matter. Different journals will be different on that, and you should always check the guidelines and try and fit your work as closely to those as possible. But what I'm looking for as an editor are your findings, your conclusions. So as long as I can find those within what you've sent me, that's the most important thing. To a certain extent, even within kind of word counts and things. You know, we are a very short format journal. We try to have things around 2,200, generally less than 3,000. But if someone sends me something that is a little bit over that, it doesn't go in the bin, we still read it. It just means that if it goes through the process, we're all gonna have to do a bit more work to reduce it back down. So it's kind of a mixed answer. Formatting both does and doesn't matter. The most important thing is that it's formatted in a way that it's not going to distract, and it's not going to frustrate. But do you have to have it kind of laid out as a paper? Absolutely not. And I would also say that around figures as well. We all know that really good figures can kind of really help promote your data and your work and your science. That being said, it kind of depends on how good you are at making your figures. If you're kind of putting them all through Adobe Illustrator with 50 layers of different art manipulations and things, one, that's not necessarily the best way to be representing your data. We want to make sure that no one's manipulating data. But also, if you just spent kind of 2 days making a really beautiful figure and then a reviewer says, we think you should change the entirety of how you display this data because this, and this, and as an editor I go, well, that's a really good way of showing that data. You've then got to go and remake that figure. So I would possibly just kind of suggest that you display things like data as simply as possible initially, until you're kind of further through the process. You do a lot more formatting than we do.
Oh, yes. We do a lot of very hands-on formatting because, yeah, we ask for things in certain formats and sometimes we don't get them. I will say there are some things that, you know, are silly formatting that you can deal with later, and there are some things when it's like you really need to make sure you have these sections or something. That's important. And yeah, figures, you know, when there's a figure where you're like, look, I know this is really complicated, but I'll walk you through it, maybe try and simplify that. I think that's like my biggest formatting thing is, like, sometimes less is more. So if I have to spend 15 minutes like squinting at a figure, trying to figure out what it means, what all the axes are, stuff like that, that's a good way that, you know, it's my job to look at it, so I'll do it, but if it's a reviewer who has 2 hours slotted for one paper, they're going to be not very appreciative. But yeah, in terms of like your actual like font and stuff like that, as long as you're not using Comic Sans. Oh god, yeah. Wingdings, don't use those. I really hate Calibri font, but that's like what all of our stuff is automatically formatted in, so I had to put that one aside for my own personal time to not use that one. But yeah, line numbers, definitely very helpful. Basically, you want to make it as easy as possible for editors and reviewers to read it, because then they'll be in better moods and they'll be nicer.
I suppose I would also just emphasize, just in case it wasn't clear, depending on where you are in the process, the formatting gets more important. So for the initial submission, I would say it's less important, crucial for line numbers. If you're at the stage where we have what we call accepted in principle, so we've said, we think this is really good, we would potentially accept this, but we need you to make these final changes. If you then ignore the formatting that I've put, I'll be annoyed. And I know it's a super long email, you know, it goes through absolutely everything. It's like, you need to change your figures, you need to change your title, you need to move your acknowledgements from here to here, you need to do this. That's because if you don't do all of those steps, we then have to spend a lot of time taking your files, realizing what you haven't done, horribly sending them back to you to alter them, because you ultimately need to be responsible for what you're sending us. You sending it back, we upload it. It delays it all for everybody. So the further through the process, the more attention you need to pay to what instructions we're giving you. If we're suggesting something that you fundamentally don't agree with because you think it's going to misrepresent your science, or we suggest a title that you don't agree with, you can always contact us as an editor and kind of say, hang on, I don't like this, not because I don't like it, but because I think it doesn't do my work justice or it doesn't represent my science. That's fine, we can have that conversation. And a lot of our job, I think you'll agree, and especially for you, is having conversations. There's so much human communication within editorial. So yeah, initial submission formatting doesn't matter as much. Final submission, do everything that we ask or explain why you haven't.
We also, as people, get frustrated with formatting, so when we ask you to do something, we know it takes a lot of time and we're really sorry, but it has to get done or it's just gonna hold everything back. And we all know by the time you get a paper to the copy editing stage and the publication stage, you're tired of looking at it yourself and you just want it published. So then doing the formatting gets it that much closer, and you can say to your advisor, look, it's done, I can graduate now, or whatever.
Hi. At the moment, I'm very new for the publications and so on, because I don't have much more idea about the publishing and so on. I would like to know, before we write a paper, do we need to think about where I'm going to publish it, which journal, and after thinking that, do I need to follow the criteria, what they need? Or how can I know about your journal criteria, these line numbers or double spacing or something like that? How can I know about those criteria? Thank you.
So I would say, we actually had a session on this on Monday. So if you come to Goldschmidt's again, there's often a kind of a scientific writing session that's really useful. The first thing is, yes, I think you should absolutely be thinking about what journal you might be submitting to when you're writing your work. And I would say the most important part of that is every journal has a different audience. And there's almost no point in starting writing if you don't know who you're writing for. Because how you communicate your science is going to depend on who is going to read your science. So if you were going to write your paper, say for instance the audience in Nature Geoscience is all geoscientists. That means that if you work on some kind of phytoplankton in the oceans, whatever you're communicating about those, you have to remember that someone who looks at deep seismicity in the Earth's mantle and core is also going to have to find something in your research. That's a very different audience to if you're writing a paper for a microbiology journal. So yes, when you're writing, you should absolutely have in mind the journal you're writing for and the audience you're writing for. And yes, you should therefore look at the guidelines, because we aren't necessarily that strict in terms of, if you go a little bit over on word count and things, but every journal is going to have a different way of laying out the paper, the way of communicating. Do they allow supplementary information? How are you going to be able to represent your data? One downside to a journal like ours is we're quite strict on figures. So generally most papers in Nature Geoscience won't have more than 4 figures, maybe 6. Some papers, no matter how good the story, will really struggle to be represented with only that kind of data and representation. So yeah, you need to think about who your audience is going to be and how your paper is going to work best when you're writing that paper. So yeah, keep it in mind.
Yeah, I totally agree. And yeah, so if you're looking for specific guidelines, usually when you go to the websites for the journals, sometimes it gets buried, but there will be some sort of link like for authors or to submit your manuscript or whatnot. And then they'll have like a page where it says more specifically like line numbers, you need page numbers, so they have specific fonts that they'll accept. Should it be double spaced, single spaced? Do you include all your figures as just upload them in a Word document, or do you have to upload each PDF or JPEG or TIFF on its own? So you just might have to click around the websites a bit. Sometimes they're harder to find.
Hi, I joined a bit later, so sorry if I am repeating some of the questions. As many of us are going through a two-body problem, I have a related question. Sometimes you have to locate yourself somewhere and you can't really work at other place. Is there any job or among the people you know in the editorial service that can be done fly-in, fly-out, or remotely?
So we mentioned earlier, you have to be in the office at least 3 days a week. Very rarely they'll allow someone who's very senior, has worked for the company for years, and they'll say, I need to be able to work remotely or something like that, but it's rare. I understand the two-body problem. My husband actually is postdocing in Barcelona, and I'm working at the office in London. But yeah, unfortunately, you have to be at one of the offices at least when you start your career. But we do have offices, like we mentioned, London, New York, Berlin, Shanghai, and then as you progress, there are some smaller offices that they'll eventually allow editors who are a bit more experienced to move to, but that's on a case-by-case basis.
Great, thanks. Or if you're a book editor, there are also other offices. So for instance, I know that in China, our book editors are mostly in Beijing rather than Shanghai, if that's of any help. No, unfortunately, we see similar problems to those that are seen in academia. A little bit similar with Laura, I know certainly a couple of colleagues who will kind of split their kind of family life and professional life between, say, Beijing and Shanghai, because their work requires them to be in Shanghai, but their personal life is in Beijing. So yeah, it's a common problem that I think many industries, not just academia, not just research, are struggling with.
Thanks.
I have a question, actually. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the salary range for editing and the different type of, I know not everyone likes to talk about money, but...
It's a very good question. And you've just started, so you can answer.
Yeah.
No, it's a really good question, and I'm saying that because some jobs, when you see a job advertised, will give you the salary kind of range that you can expect. And I think it's still the case, it was when I applied. Our jobs ask you to put down the salary that you would be willing to take. And having seen some applications, they can vary wildly in terms of what people think a kind of editorial salary would be. I would say ballpark is like, what is it, euros, pounds, dollars?
Yeah.
It's like...
Yeah, it's between 35 and 40.
Yeah. So depending on experience, so you can also come in as a senior editor if you have editorial experience before, say if you've been an academic editor. But yeah, consensus from the front of the room is starting salaries around 35 to 40,000 a year, not a month.
Yeah.
We're loaded.
That's in pounds.
Yeah. That's
which is going down by the day. So I actually started at our New York office, and those salaries are a little different. So that was about $70,000 starting, which sounded like so much coming out of a postdoc, but then you're living in New York, so not really.
But you have no holidays if you're based in New York. So that's the other thing. So I went from, my job was always going to be based in Shanghai, so the salaries change a little bit, the base salary, depending on your kind of country, but also the kind of what your human resources team have negotiated in terms of kind of country standard for holidays. So in the London office, I think the Berlin office might be better, I don't know.
It's like 25 days.
Yeah, so London, you start on 25 days holiday plus bank holidays, and then every year you work, you get an extra day's holiday until you get a maximum of 30. In Shanghai, we start on 15 days, and you can go up to 20 days, but you also get national holidays. But it still ends up a little bit less than the London office. In New York, I think you're lucky if you get 10 days, something like, it's not many. So they have a higher salary, but they're also working longer hours. And yeah, you just got to figure out what works best for you.
Hi, I'm just curious about what's the difference between editor based on the publisher company and editors based on the academic areas.
Yeah. The biggest difference between kind of what we are, so I would call us professional editors versus academic editors, is that we're no longer doing research. That's the biggest difference. It also means, on a kind of practical level, that I don't bring any kind of peer review aspect to when I'm being an editor. And my experience of publishing with academic editors is that they will potentially have some kind of insight similar to a peer reviewer, so they will be able to bring their academic knowledge to that paper. For the most of the papers that I handle, I wouldn't be able to peer review them. They're so far out of what I, as a researcher, was doing. But my job as an editor is to, as I said, kind of assess what the conclusions are, how they fit into the research landscape, and do I think my audience is going to be interested. I in no way act as a peer reviewer, so I'm not assessing the quality of the data, whether the experiments are valid, whether your statistics are good. I send that to academic peer reviewers, and then I make a judgment based on their kind of technical input. So I think that's the biggest difference. Yeah.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Yeah, so the academic editors, I think, will handle fewer manuscripts than we do on average. And I don't want to say more hands-off, I feel like that might be, but yeah, it's more like an academic service, and they're doing that in addition to their normal professorial duties or whatnot. Whereas, yeah, what we do is full-time. We are here all the time on the manuscript tracking systems and dealing with things. So if you see that you get a response quite quickly and you're like, oh wow, that was a really fast response from that editor, then yeah, it's our jobs.
Yeah, I have one just curiosity, not a question, but maybe something need to discuss. Because we have many scientists, and each scientist bring their own story and very good story, and your journal you collect very great story, because I know the Nature have very good story. So, but the problem is we want to make a story, and that story could be very helpful for the first scientist, and another is for the human. But since the human don't know about our work, I mean, for example, when I come to Goldschmidt, I don't see any journalists come to us to interview or to expand our work, because our work need to be highly respected. But nobody cares. So I think we should not only work inside community, but also should be expanding, like making human life more sense. I hope maybe you get some point. So do you think we need to do something like make connection with the people, some kind of mass media or some, to make the good story and also to explain our significant work, something like that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. This is my personal opinion, I guess. The more you can communicate your science to both other scientists and to people outside of science, I think the better. I also understand people are really busy, and sometimes that can be really difficult. So, you know, I don't want to say every scientist should be out there giving interviews, because different people have different, you know, other burdens that are obligations. But I think the more you can communicate, the better.
So I think you were in the Communicating Science workshop yesterday. So yes, I think not only as scientists do people have the opportunity and potentially the responsibility to communicate. Certainly as publishers we do, and as I mentioned, Nature has been around for 150 years and has always had this kind of dual purpose. The first is clearly communicating science to scientists, but it also has a responsibility that it takes to communicate science to the scientifically interested public. And if you go online, you can actually get hold of issues from Nature from kind of its historical archives, and you can go back and see such excellent titles as things like Lectures to Ladies. So this idea that maybe you should educate women, which at the time was revolutionary. It also had the option, this was in the UK, of, I think they were called the penny lectures, an idea that working class men would pay their penny from their salary and go and see scientific lectures. And that has now progressed through to us, for instance, writing press releases on articles that we think are going to be either of scientific curiosity to the public, or indeed around sort of climate change issues, sustainability, economic geology, resources, because we think it's, and as a company, we do try and facilitate that and to give papers kind of some life and some space in the media. That being said, you know, we're scientific editors first and foremost, we're not journalists. So often is a case of, if your paper is put out there at the same time as a natural disaster or something going on in politics, it might not get the space it maybe would have deserved. So I think it's something that we all need to practice more of, get more engaged with. If you're interested, then yeah, just keep practicing the scientific communication. But absolutely from a kind of publishing company point of view, it's something that we try and do.
Sorry, but we need to finish it and leave it here. Thank you so much, Becca and Laura, for coming today and answering all these questions. And let's give them applause. And thank you all for coming. This is it for the non-academic careers. It's the end of the session today. I hope you enjoyed it, and if you could give review and stuff for the next Goldschmidts, we'll appreciate that. Thank you.
And just to say, I'm sure Laura would say the same, that if you see us around the conference, you can always kind of say hi and ask us questions. And if we're busy, we'll make a time to kind of talk to you later. So if you have more questions, stop and say hi.